There's a specific kind of employee everyone in a decent-sized organization has met once. The one quietly teaching someone else how to do a job that leadership had deliberately kept concentrated in a small circle, a handful of people trusted with certain client relationships and decision-making access, because a workforce like that is easier to control. Not because the mentor had to teach it, because withholding it felt ungenerous. For a while it looked like generosity being rewarded. The protégé got sharper, started getting invited into rooms leadership had kept deliberately small. Then something shifted. It wasn't the protégé who lost ground, it was the mentor whose own access to those same rooms got quietly narrowed by the same leadership that had drawn the boundary in the first place. Nobody explained why. You'd get something vague about restructuring delivered by someone who couldn't quite look at you while saying it. What actually happened is simpler and colder. Leadership had drawn a line around who was allowed to know certain things. The mentor moved someone across that line without permission, and leadership answered by moving the mentor instead. You don't have to work in an office to recognize this. A senior doctor whose hospital administration restricts an advanced technique to a small, favored group, not for patient safety, but to control who rises into leadership, teaches a resident the technique anyway, outside the sanctioned pathway. No harm follows, the resident performs it well. The hospital quietly excludes her from the committee that decides who gets those opportunities next, or a pastor whose church elders keep real decision-making, budget, hiring, doctrine inside a closed circle, deliberately excluding newer members regardless of readiness. He brings a younger member into real decisions anyway. The elders don't discipline the member, they quietly start rooting pastoral authority around the pastor himself, the way they'd route it around anyone they no longer trusted with what belonged, in their view, only to them. The settings change, the mechanism doesn't. Someone hands over access, knowledge, or standing that a structure above them had deliberately decided to keep scarce, and the structure retaliates not against the receiver but against the one who gave it away. It usually unfolds in stages, and most people only recognize the shape of it in hindsight. First, there's bewilderment, meetings you're no longer in, a warmth that's gone cold for no stated reason. Then in many cases, self-blame. You comb back through what you did, certain you must have overstepped, said the wrong thing, moved too fast. Then anger, once the self-blame runs out of evidence and starts to feel unfair, even to you. And only afterward, sometimes much later, does the actual pattern come into focus. The thing being punished was never a mistake you made, but a boundary you crossed that you didn't know was a boundary until you'd already crossed it. This isn't a story about ingratitude. Nobody punished the mentor for helping. What got punished was something else entirely, an alteration in who was allowed to hold what. And once you see that distinction clearly, you start noticing it everywhere. The question worth sitting with is this: why does redistributing power get punished harder and for longer than simply hoarding it? There's an old story built almost entirely around this exact mechanism, and it's survived something like 2,700 years because it never stopped being true. In Hesiod's telling, fire belonged to the gods, not because mortals were incapable of using it, but because Zeus had made a deliberate decision to withhold it after Prometheus outmaneuvered him in a dispute over how sacrifices would be divided between gods and men. Prometheus, a titan technically aligned with the gods but sympathetic to human beings, took a power Zeus had deliberately withheld from mortals, kept for the gods alone, and handed it to them anyway. What happened next is the part people remember. Hesiod tells it in a few brutal lines. Zeus chained Prometheus and set an eagle on him to eat his liver, which grew back each night. The rock and the crag come from the later tragedy, Prometheus Bound, a punishment with no scheduled end. But the detail that actually matters for us isn't the cruelty of the sentence, it's the shape of the crime. Prometheus wasn't punished for harming anyone. Humanity wasn't hurt by receiving fire. Humanity was transformed by it. He was punished because he changed who controlled something Zeus intended to control alone. That's the part of the myth people skip past, because the eagle is the vivid image, but the eagle isn't the lesson. The lesson is in the logic Zeus used to justify it. Prometheus didn't steal something Zeus needed. Fire didn't disappear from Olympus when mortals got it. Zeus lost nothing tangible. What he lost was exclusivity, the fact that only he and the gods had gotten to decide who was capable of technology, warmth, protection, civilization itself. Once mortals had fire, that decision no longer belonged to Zeus alone. And an authority that builds its identity around being the sole gatekeeper of something will tend to treat the loss of exclusivity as a wound, even when nothing was actually taken from it. This is the mechanism, stripped of mythology. Authority is not just the ability to grant or withhold a resource. It's the ability to decide who gets to have it. When someone else makes that decision instead, even generously, even correctly, the authority doesn't experience it as help. It experiences it as a challenge to its own legitimacy. Legitimacy, unlike a single resource, doesn't get defended with a single punishment. It tends to get defended for far longer than the event would seem to justify, because the threat isn't read as a one-time loss, but as a precedent. That's why the mentor's exile from the important meetings never had a stated end date. Retaliation like this can outlast the event that triggered it by years, quietly reshaping a career long after anyone remembers the original offense. It helps to notice how differently this behaves compared to ordinary jealousy. Jealousy is personal. It wants the other person to have less, specifically because you have less. What Zeus does to Prometheus isn't that. It isn't envy of one titan's generosity. It's closer to an immune response. Something in the system detects an outside change to its own boundaries and reacts to defend the boundary itself, almost independent of who caused the change or why. An immune response doesn't measure how dangerous the intruder really was before it mobilizes. It just responds to the fact of breach. Look at how consistently this shows up once you check for the actual mechanism rather than the surface story. A manager works inside a company that deliberately keeps client relationships and systems knowledge concentrated in one person per function, not for operational reasons, but because it's easier for leadership to control a workforce that way. The manager trains a subordinate into that same knowledge anyway. Leadership doesn't reward the subordinate's growth. It quietly starts treating the manager as replaceable because the scarcity leadership engineered no longer exists. A department chair restricts grant writing templates and funding contacts to 2 senior faculty, controlling who can apply for the department's most prestigious grants. A senior faculty member shares them with junior colleagues who'd been quietly excluded for years, and the junior faculty start winning grants. The chair excludes her, not them, from committee assignments that used to be automatic. A founder holds board-level control investors deliberately structured to stay with one person, so the board would only ever manage a single relationship. The founder brings in a co-founder and genuinely splits real authority with them. The board doesn't push out the co-founder, it pushes out the founder, the one who broke the single point of control structure the board had built. An employee reports something a company's leadership had deliberately kept confined to a small circle. Evidence of harm or wrongdoing a handful of executives had decided, explicitly, needed to stay contained. The information itself doesn't hurt anyone by becoming known. If anything, it protects people who would otherwise have been harmed by staying in the dark. Even so, and even when an outside investigation later confirms the report was accurate, the reporter's career can struggle to recover the way you'd expect a correct, honest act to be rewarded. They get recast quietly in the internal story leadership tells about itself afterward. Not as the person who was right, but as the person who couldn't be trusted with what they knew. A parent grows up inside a family or community that deliberately limits what its children are allowed to know about life outside it, which colleges exist, which careers are acceptable, which questions are allowed to be asked out loud, because a closed system stays easier to control, the less its children can imagine leaving it. That parent, raising their own child inside the same system, quietly gives them what the system withheld: information about the outside, permission to ask the forbidden questions, active help getting into a life the family never sanctioned. The child leaves and thrives. The system doesn't retaliate against the child so much as against the parent, through exclusion from family gatherings, through being blamed by relatives for putting ideas in the child's head, through a version of belonging that quietly stops being offered. Whether each of these people was right to do what they did is a separate question, one worth asking honestly rather than assuming the answer either way. What's consistent across all of them doesn't depend on that answer. Each of them redistributed something, a technique, a piece of governance, a fact, a piece of the outside world that some structure above them had deliberately decided to keep scarce. And in each of these cases, the consequence didn't land on the person who received it. It landed on the person who gave it away. Here's the part that tends to blindside people when it happens to them. They expect to be judged on intent. If the reason you shared access was generous, you believed in someone, you thought the information deserved to exist outside one office, you wanted your kid to have a wider life than you did, you assume that generosity will be legible to whoever's in charge. You rehearse the reasoning in your head as if it were a defense you might one day need to give out loud. That defense doesn't always get the chance to matter. Structures of authority don't evaluate intent particularly well, because intent isn't the thing that threatens them. What threatens them is the redistribution itself, independent of why it happened. A monopoly doesn't care whether it was broken accidentally, maliciously, or out of love. It only registers that it's been broken. This produces a very specific kind of confusion in the person being punished, because the punishment doesn't map onto any wrongdoing they can identify. They search their own conduct for the offense and can't find one because there isn't one, not in the sense they're looking for. What they're actually being punished for isn't an action, it's a consequence of that action, a shift in who holds something permanently, whether or not anyone intended the shift to be permanent. And in many cases, the structure doesn't even name it accurately, even to itself. The mentor gets quietly relabeled as difficult. The whistleblower gets relabeled as not a team player. The parent gets relabeled, in family law, as the one who pushed too hard. The relabeling isn't a lie exactly, it's a story a structure tells itself, so it doesn't have to admit what it's actually defending. If you're in the middle of this right now, rather than looking back at it, the earliest sign can be quieter than open hostility. It can look like silence where there used to be inclusion, a meeting you're no longer looped into, a decision made one level up without your input, a warmth that's cooled by exactly 1 degree. Nothing you could point to in a complaint. That subtlety is not an accident. Open hostility would require the structure to explain itself, and explaining itself would mean admitting, even privately, what it's actually defending. If any of this sounds familiar, it's worth being precise about what you're carrying. If you taught someone something you weren't supposed to, if you gave someone access that thinned out your own exclusivity, if you told a truth that was supposed to stay buried, if you let someone you loved become more independent than the system around you wanted them to be, the discomfort that followed wasn't proof you did something wrong, and it wasn't proof you did something right either. It was proof, more simply, that something with power noticed the shift and didn't like it, and whether the shift deserved to happen is a separate question, worth asking honestly rather than assuming the answer. There's a slower cost underneath the obvious one, worth naming directly. because it tends to outlast the original punishment by a wide margin. People who go through this once can become quietly stingier afterward without ever deciding to. The next time they're in a position to teach someone everything, they may hold something back. The next time they could speak up, they may calculate first. Not out of bitterness exactly, more like a learned caution, the same way a hand that's been burned once hovers differently near heat afterward. That caution can look, from the outside, like wisdom. From the inside, it can be grief for a version of yourself that used to give things away freely and hasn't fully trusted itself to do that since. The guilt attaches easily because guilt is looking for an action to blame, and I gave something away feels like an action you can point to. But guilt calibrated to actual wrongdoing and guilt calibrated to having disturbed a structure of control are two different signals wearing the same emotional texture. Only one of them deserves the weight you're likely giving it, and many people carry both at once without ever fully separating them. None of this means every act of sharing power is automatically noble, or every consequence automatically unjust. Sometimes access gets given away carelessly, a responsibility handed to someone who wasn't ready, a private matter shared with someone untrustworthy. The real test isn't whether an authority restricted something, nearly every structure does. It's what the restriction was protecting, real people from real, specific harm, or the authority's own grip on who gets to decide. A licensing board keeping someone from practicing medicine before they're qualified is protecting patients who never consented to being anyone's practice case. An executive who freezes out the manager who trained a capable successor isn't protecting anyone. They're protecting their own position from a colleague who is now, provably, replaceable. The same restriction, wearing the language of process and readiness. Redistribution isn't automatically virtuous just because it moves power away from a hoarder, and the punishment that follows isn't automatic proof, in either direction, of who was right. What this pattern actually explains isn't whether a redistribution was justified, it's why the response tends to track the loss of exclusivity more than any measurable harm that followed. Collapsing those two questions is its own mistake. So here's the reframe worth sitting with. The price you paid, or the price you're still paying, for giving something away wasn't automatically a verdict on your character in either direction. It was, at minimum, a structure defending its own shape. Structures don't usually do this consciously. Nobody sits in a meeting and says, out loud, let's punish him for training his replacement. It happens through smaller mechanisms, quiet exclusions, subtle reassignments, a coolness that never gets explained, a story that gets rewritten about who you were all along, but the underlying logic is the same one that put Prometheus on that rock. An authority experienced the loss of its monopoly as a wound, and someone had to absorb that wound so the structure could feel, again, like it was still in control of who gets what. That leaves you with an actual choice. Before you make it, ask the harder question honestly. Did the boundary you crossed exist to protect someone else from real harm, or to protect the authority's grip on exclusivity? The punishment you receive doesn't answer that by itself, it only proves the boundary was defended. If it was protecting exclusivity rather than protecting anyone from harm, you still have a choice about what to do with what happened. You can let it teach you to hold on tighter next time, stop training your replacement, stop mentioning what you know that no one else does, stop giving your kids more room than you were given. That's understandable. No one who hasn't paid this price gets to judge it from outside. Or you can decide the price is one you're willing to keep paying because what you gave mattered enough to be worth it. In the tragedy, Prometheus is never shown recanting. Oceanus urges him to soften his defiance and offers to intercede. Prometheus does not yield. Later, Zeus's messenger demands the secret he knows. Prometheus refuses, and the play ends with him still defiant. That's the part worth carrying out of the story and into your own life, because it's the only part that was ever really about him, not about Zeus. The eagle came back every day, and the fire stayed given anyway. Mortals kept it, built lives around it, long after the punishment started. If you're paying a price right now for something you handed to someone else, something the structure around you wanted, kept out of their hands, the price is real and exhausting to carry. But it was never automatic proof you were wrong to give it. It was only ever proof of what it cost the people above you to lose their grip on who gets to decide, and that grip, not your character, was what was actually on trial. The fire didn't go back to Olympus. That's the part worth remembering on the days the price feels heaviest. Whatever you gave away is still out there, doing what it was always going to do wherever it ended up. The punishment changes nothing about that. It only ever changes what it costs you to have done it, and on its own, it still doesn't settle whether giving it away was the right call to begin with.